In this session, we're going to be discussing the Sage Intacct payroll journal entry mappings. And we're going to talk about how you can affect the postings for the general ledger as far as what general ledger accounts they hit, and also at what level of detail post in for the payroll entries. So let's go through a few key takeaways that you want to consider as you're going through configuring your payroll journal entry mappings. Give me 1 second here. So one of the things that you want to be cautious with is you are going to have a live class on this, and would recommend signing up for the live class, especially when you get to the journal entry mapping discussions. You want to discuss them ahead of time in the live class. The consultants can help you review your general ledger structure, see what different options and how you want to post to the general ledger for payroll. You may have direct labor for your construction projects like cost of sales labor or WIP labor. You might have service projects that you want to post service labor to. You might have some overhead stuff like shop and yard. And then you might have some office or admin type wage accounts. And that's all going to help determine how many different mappings you may need and need to set up in the system. And the only true way you're going to know is if your mappings are adequate enough is when we get into the testing phase. Is we're going to go through and test this and make sure it's posting correctly and how you want it to post. And we'll make adjustments throughout the process to fine tune that for you. Start out by keeping it simple. One mapping for each type of postings. For example, you might have project mapping for all of your live construction projects. You might have an overhead mapping for times when maybe your field, staff isn't working on a project, working on the yard, working in the shop, and maybe you have a different general ledger account you want to go to when that happens. Office. You may have office that all goes into one account called office wages, or you might break it out a little bit. So you're going to want to think about that, but keep it simple. You don't want to have, for example, direct project wages, direct project taxes, direct project. You don't want to break these up. It just makes it more complex. Just put all of your accounts in one place under these mappings. If you choose and config and you have the option to set up auto salary, meaning we're not going to put in hours for this individual employee, we just want to generate an auto salary when we process checks, you do have the ability to set up its own separate mapping for that as far as the general ledger goes. And when you do that, one thing to consider is every line in that mapping, you cannot have any of them turned on to the job or location, which is also related to the job, because those auto salary employees are never going to be charged to a job. When they're not going to enter time, therefore there's no way to post it to a job. So we need to make sure that the mapping is going directly to the general ledger, and you'll see in the mappings where you can turn on and off those buttons. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. When you get into your journal entry mapping entry screens, you're going to basically be able to decide on, hey, if I use this hour type, here's where I want it to go in the general ledger for the expense account. Here's where I want it to go for the payroll clearing account. For FICA, here's where I want it to go for the employer side, the employee side for your payables and your expense accounts. You're going to be able to determine that individually by the GL account itself. You're also going to be able to determine for each one of those mappings whether you want to turn on or off project information. So if this is a direct projects mapping or posting, you want to hit your burdens. You want your employer FICA, employer Medicare to hit the project. So for that debit side of the entry, you want to make sure you turn on project detail so that we can get job costing by project. You may also want to turn on detail for departments. You may also want to see in your general ledger within that project, each individual employee that was posted to it. Now, the key here is this is how it posts to the general ledger, okay? So the big question you want to ask yourself during this process is, do I want employee level details showing up in my general ledger? And the answer to that a lot is no. There's going to be some individuals within the organization that are going to have access to the general ledger transactions, and we don't want them to see employee level payroll detail. So you can elect to turn off the employee level when it goes to general ledger, but you will still be able to get detailed employee reporting directly through the payroll reporting tables, which you can secure separately. So some people elect to keep employee detail off when they post through the mapping, but then run their employee detail through payroll reporting tables. Others, they put the employee detail. It's an optional piece. This is something you can do while you're testing, see how it looks, decide to turn it on or off. And that can be by each individual check item. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So let's take you through a little diagram of visually how a journal entry mapping will work. Basically, there's going to be two ways to get pay into the system in the payroll module. You're either going to do it through what's called hourly time entry or reimbursement pays. Like you might add a bonus, you might add some mileage or a per diem. So everything's going to get entered in through what we call a time card in payroll. Then, like I mentioned earlier, you can do auto salary pay. We're not going to enter any time entries for the auto salary. It's just going to automatically add it when we generate a check. So there's two methods, and they get the mapping a little bit differently. So for the hourly or the time, we'll call it the time card entry, things like regular overtime, double time, vacation, a bonus pay, per diem, mileage, all of that's going to get keyed in as a time entry. And with that being said, Sage Intacct is always, and I'll repeat, is always going to require a project to be put in for that time. So you'll notice that's even for bonus, that's even for office employees that are getting hourly pay, regular hourly pay. It's going to require a project. You could determine and you can set up overhead type projects. People might call one, some examples might be, you might just have a simple office project for office hourly. You might have shop or yard or overhead job that you put it for field employees who aren't working on a live project. So you're going to need some projects set up in your system that aren't your traditional live construction projects. Okay. And that is where, when we set up that project in payroll, there's going to be a place you'll see in the next couple series here in videos. There's going to be a place to say, for this project, I want to use this GL mapping. So for your live projects, you might use your direct cost or your project mapping. But for some of those overhead projects like office, shop, yard, you might have a mapping called shop, a mapping called yard. So every time an entry hits one of those jobs, it'll use a different mapping. And that's kind of how it funnels through here. So for example, let's say for this example, we've entered some time to an actual project called 25001 and some regular time. But we've also entered some time to a project called shop, REG as well, regular as well. Each of those projects are going to have different mappings set up. So in the live project, the 25001, it's going to be coded to, let's say, for example, a mapping called project mapping. In there, we can set up, and we'll see this next, we can set up where we can say whenever REG is used in the project mapping, it goes to 550-100 cost of sales labor. And then we could set up our shop job in payroll. And for the shop job, we might put it to a mapping called shop mapping or overhead mapping or whatever you want to call it. It really depends on your general ledger structure. And you can say whenever an employee code is coded to a shop job and it's REG, it's going to use a 601 GL account called shop labor. So it can be, determined and split based on these projects. You might have a very common one for example, for office staff or admin staff that is paid hourly. You might have a job called office, and that job might have an office mapping and it goes to office wages or something like that. So you can do as many of these as you want. And that's where in these live sessions and Q&A, we can have further discussions on this and make some recommendations for you one-on-one. For auto salary, it's a little different. For auto salary, there's no time entered. So it's going to look directly at the employee setup for the salary amount and also for the mapping. So inside the employee setup for anybody who's on auto salary, that's where we're going to link the mapping. And so in this case, we might have a mapping just for auto salary called salary mapping. And in there, it's going to grab, let's say, administration wages. Now, these are all examples, of course. These aren't set in stone. This is going to be for your company specifically. But basically, that is the idea there. And again, as you're talking through this, join a Q&A, get on a live class. This is the one area you want to talk this out and test a lot in the system. So let's go ahead and dive into the software now. And I'm going to go over to here, and I believe I got my software right here. We'll take a look. So as a consultant, where I usually start with a company would be, I would go look and take a quick look at their cost types for the projects to start. I would come into here and I would look at the cost types, and I would say, all right, it looks like you guys are set up to, oh, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong area. My apologies. I want to go to standard cost types. Let's go into standard cost types here. And you can see kind of, what wages you might be using. You can see here, whenever it's labor, it's going to 550, 100 for labor. So that's my, what I would call my direct labor. I would also go look at the general ledger and just see what your structure is. Now, this is the time to consolidate. A lot of times from legacy systems, we do see clients having just a ton of different wage accounts for payroll broken out. And you really want to ask yourself at this point, is that necessary? Do we need to break it out this way? Can we consolidate it? The simpler you make your general ledger, the simpler your GL mappings are going to be on the payroll side. In my demo environment here, I have a couple different options. You might be doing WIP counting for your project, so you may want to go to the WIP labor account. In this case, we're using the cost of sales, so I'm really going to start down here, and I'm going to look at my cost of sales. So to me, this is my first mapping, my direct labor, my project mapping is going to be going to cost of sales labor. And then I would venture down and see what other wage accounts that you guys might have set up in the system. So for example, I see here, I have office wages, shop and warehouse wages. So to me, this is probably where I'm going to set up my next level, where I might have an overhead or a yard or shop mapping. And then I'm going to have, an office or admin expense. So this might be one area here where I would suggest consolidating. Do we really need these broken out between office wages and admin compensation? So, you can ask yourself and combine that. There is definitely a way to just break these out and post separately, but I would possibly combine that. So let's assume that we did decide and we're going to combine it all to the 610. And then everything else is going to go to shop and warehouse. So I'm really thinking about 3 levels here. So once I get that idea, I would then come over to payroll and I would go to my journal entry mappings, which is over in setup. I do have some samples already set up here. We're going to ignore those for now. We're going to pretend they don't exist. This is one example, one way that you can do this: direct charges, indirect charges. I'm going to recommend creating a new one here and I usually recommend calling it project mapping. Okay, something like that. Get your effective dates on January 1. And at that point, just save it. Build them out. So we have project mapping. Now, under project mapping, after looking at my setup in my general ledger, I'm probably going to have an overhead field mapping or overhead non-job or something like that. Let's just call it overhead mapping, but you can call it whatever you want. And you could duplicate these so you can call it one thing and then rename it later if you want to. And then I'm going to have one just for office. I'm going to combine those two expense accounts. So I'm just going to need a third here for office. Actually, what I'm going to do is, for ease of use, is I'm just going to delete these out of here so that we don't even see them. Apologize for that. Let's delete those out of there. Okay. And then I'm going to make a third one here. Let's call it admin or office. Let's call it admin wages. Or not wages, because more than wages. Admin mapping, something like that. Okay. And so now I really have my three mappings that would really replicate what we looked at in that diagram earlier, where instead of shop here, I might have, this might be overhead mapping here. Okay, so same idea. So what you can do then, what you need to do with these mappings is, and this is the work, does take some time to set this up. There is also an option to import these, and we have done in some cases where there is a lot of different setups, a lot of different pay modifiers. We can discuss about importing these so you don't have to do these manually. I will say in best practice, most people do them manually because it really, as they go through it, they're going to be thinking, they're going to be selecting which GL accounts, they're going to be working through it. So once you get through it, it's going to be set up, and hopefully you won't have to touch it unless you add new check items. So one of the things you need to do is, notice this says check items. Anything that we've set up so far to date in our sessions, in our classes, that could possibly be on a employee's check needs to be set up. So always consider you're in the project mapping. So for example, if you never charge vacation to actual projects, you don't necessarily need to code vacation in the project mapping, right? Because you'll never do it. So you can think about that and not set it up if you know you're never going to use it. Now, it doesn't hurt to set it up here because it's just never going to come in play. So it doesn't hurt you to set it up in here. But when I click add check items, what it's going to do here is it's going to show me everything that's in the system yet that hasn't been set up in this mapping. So what is nice is as you set up each one of these check items, it will go away off the list. So if you're setting up all the items here, eventually you'll know you're done because there'll be nothing left on the list. I usually recommend starting in order. So starting with wages. So I'm just going to use REG, and you can best fit here. So you see how this says gross pay? I believe you can type in gross pay and it'll show you all your wages. So yep, for an actual project, we're going to have regular pay. So you're going to select the check item. Then you're going to click add journal entry. And so I usually do the debit side first, the expense side first. And in this case, if it's a project mapping, if it's a live project, I said I wanted to use cost of sales labor. So you can type in your GL account number, you can search on it. The batch date, best practice, should always be check date. That's the date that is going to be off the W-2s and how it's going to post to your general ledger by check date. And you want to be careful of your transaction amount here. In some cases, you'll have multiple options. The wages, you don't. You just have one option here, so you can't get that wrong. I'll show you an example of a tax where you can have multiple options. And then, what side of the entry are we talking about? Credit, debit. Be careful of this. This is the one area that people do, accidentally put 2 credits, 2 debits. It will not alert you. So you'll find it out during testing when we get an error message, but at this point, you won't find it out. So it's a debit. Okay. Now, this is where we talked about, some things to consider. What level of detail do I want to send over to the general ledger? So this is project mapping. So and this is the debit side. This is the cost of labor. So we do want a job cost entry for cost of sales labor for regular wages. We do want the job turned on. Okay. If you're using departments in any way in Intacct, you definitely want the departments turned on, especially on the expense side. Okay. Location is only if you're using jobs, again, and you have multiple locations for the job. So basically the rule of thumb is, hey, if I have the job turned on, turn on location. Okay. In most cases, you will not need class because you're not going to be using the class dimension in the system. But if you are using the class dimension and you have some defaults set up on the project or on the employee record, you can turn class on. It will not hurt you if you turn this on in accident. It doesn't really matter at that point. But in most cases, leave it off. Your biggest question, again, is going to be, do I want employee detail in the general ledger for wage information? I'm going to say no. I don't want to see employee detail in here, so I'm going to leave it off. We'll talk about these cost type overrides and cost code overrides when we get into the taxes area. You're never going to need override. I shouldn't say never. In most cases, you're not going to need a cost type override when you're doing wages. Basically, it's going to go to the cost type that you put in on the time record, which would be LAB. Okay, so that's the debit side. Now, we talked about in some of the earlier videos in the pre-configuration when we were getting ready, one of the things we needed to do was set up a payroll clearing account that we can post the other side of the entry to until we take it through the check process. This is where we're going to use that. So for example, I'm going to hit add here, hit the plus. We need to do the credit side. Well, this is wages. This means we're giving employees cash. So we're increasing their net pay. So the payroll clearing account to me is equivalent to their net pay. If we want to increase the employee's net pay, we're going to credit the payroll clearing account. If we're going to decrease the net pay, we're going to debit. That's kind of the rule here. So I think I called it 19. Yep. You're going to want to remember what your payroll clearing. You can also type in payroll and it'll show you too. You can find it. So payroll clearing is going to be my credit side. Check. Gross pay again, and it's the credit. I do not need anything in detail turned on the clearing account, on the credit side. Sometimes companies do elect and like to have it broken out by employee, because typically if someone's looking at the GL, they're looking at the expense side, not the credit side. And it's also helpful at first when you're doing reconciliation and testing. If you have the employee level turned on, you should basically see the clearing account show the employee's correct net pay for every employee. So that's an optional piece. I'm going to leave it off here. And then I'm going to click save just so I don't lose my changes. So you can save as much as you want. And now you'll notice you have a mapping for regular pay. So you would continue to do this for every possible wage that you have for projects, overtime, double time. Okay, all of those different wages that you have in there, even if it's the same general ledger accounts, you have to list them. So if you're missing one, if you key in double time when you're processing payroll and it's not listed in this mapping, we're going to get an error message. So overtime, double time, all of that needs to be listed out here. You do the same thing. You'd hit add check item. And now you would grab, if I hit gross pay, now you'll notice I don't see REG on this list. Then you would grab your overtime, your double time. You might not need holiday. You might not need vacation here because you're not going to charge those directly to a job. Maybe an overhead job, but not the project mapping job. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead and let's do a tax. So with taxes, some taxes have both, well, this would be true for 401k as well. They have multiple sides of the entry. So FICA and Medicare, for example, there's an employee and an employer side. So you need to make sure you're doing 4 lines of entry here. So for example, if I'm doing FICA, I would hit add journal entry. And if you notice over here in the transaction amount, you have an employee amount and an employer amount. And for each one of those, you're going to have a debit and a credit. So I'll start with my debit and my expense side again. So I do want to burden these payroll employer taxes to the job. So, sometimes you have a separate cost of sales account called labor burden, which you could put it to. In this case, I don't. I'm just going to throw everything into cost of sales labor, even the burden. I'm going to say check date again, and I'm going to do I'm going to do the employer side because that would be the expense side. And I'm going to do the debit. So for the employer side, I do want to charge it to the job, department, location. Now, I may elect, even though I'm posting to the same general ledger account, I may elect to put it to a different cost type. So if I duplicate my screen here and I jump over and look at under projects, look at my standard cost type list. It's really going to be dependent on how you set up your system. In my system here, I do have a separate one for labor burden, so I'm going to use that. And you can see here, I do have one for overtime and regular, although I wouldn't recommend this for best practice, just usually one called labor. That's what we're going to use. So, but I do want to break my burden out. I happen to call this BUR. It could be LB. It could be whatever it is you want. I called it BUR. So if I go back to my mapping, here's where I can say, when you post this to the job, don't post it to the LAB, post it to BUR. You have to get the ID exactly correct. But now this will take all of your burden that we set up. Could be union benefits, could be, food, suit, all of those things. You can all code it to burden. So that's how you do that there. And then I would hit add. Now on the employer side, we're not affecting an employee's net pay. We have to pay it though, right? We're collecting it and we're paying it for the employee. So we need to find our FICA payable. So you may have one, you may not. It might be employer taxes. There's all different kinds here. It all depends on you, but it looks like in my demo data, I have an accrued federal payroll tax liabilities or FICA. So I do have one, and I have an ER and an EE. This is the ER. You might just have one, and that's fine. And now we'll say employer side again, and this is the credit side. And then here I don't need any detail, and I don't need any cost type. Well, you can't because the job's. Now I would continue and do the employee side. Now for the debit side, this is the piece that gets set up incorrectly the most, because everyone's used to putting the expense here on the debit side. Well, for the employee, there's no company expense for the employee side. The debit side is actually reducing net pay because it's less money they're going to get in their paycheck on the employee side. So the debit side is going to actually be the clearing account. So if I say employee debit, it's the clearing account. Now on the employee side, I don't need anything. I don't need any job detail turn on. It's not posting to the job cost. We're just collecting it. The employee paid it. We're collecting it and paying it for the employee. So on the credit side though, that could be the same account. And a lot of cases, it is the same account. In mine, it's not. They have a separate one here for EE and ER. So in that one, I would grab the EE. But in most cases, it's kind of like payroll, federal, payable, or something like that. Keep it simple. So we'll fill that out. Check date, employee, credit. So I have 4 entries here. It's going to be like that for FICA, Medicare. The most robust one in the system is 401k. If you look at the 401k, we won't set it up, but I'll show it to you. Here's that 401k and Roth one that we did. If I hit add here, look at all these options, because we have both the after-tax and the pre-tax. You may have it all go to one account, but you still need to set up all of the different options. If you have pre-tax, if you have Roth and 401k, you need to make sure at the minimum you set up pre-tax contribution and after-tax contribution. And then you also most likely going to have to set up after-tax match and pre-tax match. But then you might have catch-up stuff. So all of these need to be set up. They might all be the same GL accounts, but you still need to set them up. Okay. And now for the match ones, that's a burden. You would want to post that to the job cost, but for the other ones, you wouldn't. So that's going to be the same flow throughout all of the burdens. So if you're doing food, suit, You'll notice like, be cautious on things like food. For example, because it's a tax, it's always going to offer you an employee side. Well, FUTA doesn't have an employee side, so just make sure you're on the employer side. This would be all of your state taxes. If you have multiple states, all of that needs to be set up. Okay, and it's from the perspective, if we're using a live project, what expense accounts do we want it to hit? Okay, so you would continue down that list and fill all those out. Now, one option you do have is if if everything's going to be similar in all your 3-year mappings as far as the check items you use, you can go through and get the project mapping set up. And then what some people elect to do is duplicate it. You can come into here and say, all right, the project mapping set up. Now I want to duplicate it. I'm going to call it shop mapping as January 1 and save. Now you have all that setup that you did for project over in shop. And then you could individually go into this and say, all right, well, for shop jobs, I don't want it going to cost of sales. I want it going to 601, which I don't think I have a 601. I think there's a shop one. Yep. I want it going to shop labor. And because this is, an overhead, I'll call it a fake job. I don't need it to go to the job, but I do want it to go to department. Okay, so you could leave it on like that. Save. So this kind of helps a little bit with the setup because you don't have to set up all the lines. You just have to go in and change the lines that change. Now, this wouldn't be wages. I'm sorry. This would be like payroll taxes or something like that. So there might be, so you can see here, if I go down now, I might have a different payroll expense account for non-job or shop, which I do here. I have payroll tax expense FICA, and I could put it to that one. Well, that's really the only difference between the mappings is now you can say, all right, well, if I pick shop mapping, here's where it goes. And you can set all those up. So you can do it 2 ways. So the only thing different would be like an admin for the auto salary, which we're going to use for admin. Now you can also use for your office hourly. You can, in some cases, use the same mapping as the auto salary. You just have to be sure that when you set this up, you don't turn on any job buttons. So for example, if I'm doing admin mapping, there is going to be, notice the one thing that we've never set up so far in the system yet is the auto salary pay ID. There is an automatic internal one that's in here by default. If I go to type in salary, this one right here is the auto salary. It's the salary that's spelled out and it's always there. So you'd say this is for auto salary. And we want to do let me see, it was office. Yeah, we said we were going to use office wages, debit. We're not going to turn on any job or location because it's going to be used for auto salary. We can have department, we can have employee, and then it would be the net pay. Or the payroll clearing, I'm sorry. Credit. Save. Now, we might also want to use the hourly employees here for office. So we'd want to add REG to this. And you could do that because we're going to put them to the same account. We're going to put them to office. We said we want to consolidate in this case, right? So we're going to put it to office wages still. But they're going to get coded to REG, so we got to make sure we have that link. We can put departments on it. We cannot put job and location. You'll get an error message. And you can do that. Payroll clearing. And what did I forget? Check date. And credit. So you can do that. So the deductions, keep in mind, you want to really make sure that, because the deductions don't really stand out too much here besides your naming convention. So some people will put the expense account on the deductions when they shouldn't. The expense account should only be on the employer side. So like, for example, dental employee. Again, your debit side is going to reduce payroll clearing because it's less money the employee is getting. So that one would be debit. And then there's probably a dental payable or something like that. Health and dental insurance payable. And that's going to be the other side. And that might be the same for every mapping, whether it's admin or project mapping, but you have to list it in all three places. So hopefully that will give you enough to go on for your journal entry mapping rules. We're going to show you in the next couple of videos, based on the diagram I showed you, as to where to put that on the project next and on the employee next. So you'll see that. But the first step is to get these built out and to get them close before you start, configuring them to the projects themselves directly. So again, any questions, please join a Q&A, sign up for the live class, and we will keep moving you forward here. Thank you.